My name's David Walker. I am director of RSS getstats, and I confess immediately I am, by quote profession unquote, I say that with some heavy irony, a journalist. So I'm not disinterested in listening to, I hope, some strong criticism of the quality of statistical work in the British media. The argument behind the session is based upon what seems to me now is evident fact, which is that journalists and bloggers by and large lack statistical grounding. We're making efforts at RSS getstats to improve the training offered on media education courses, but there's a long way to go, despite, we note recently, the growing popularity of data journalism courses. More fundamental, perhaps, to be picked up in discussion is whether the nature of the story as conceived by journalists and writers and activists in the media can ever accommodate the uncertainty that's at the heart of statistical reasoning. Journalists' stories need definition. The available numbers rarely supply exactitude. In the gap, statistics get abused and misused. Discuss. My great pleasure to welcome to RSS 2012 three people with a great vantage over the question of stories, the media, and statistics. They are Penny Young, Chief Executive of NatCen, National Centre for Social Research, the non-profit social research company. Penny used to be Head of Audiences at the BBC Trust, and before that, Research Director of Which, the consumer campaigner and publisher. Earlier in her career, Penny spent some time at the Office of National Statistics. And for the social media types, she tweets as @Penny, capital Y, NatCen. Aleks Collingwood is Programme Manager, Statistics and Quantitative Specialist at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the great social research charity specialising in poverty, housing and the elderly. Aleks too worked for NatCen earlier in her career on longitudinal studies, and before that, like Penny, at the ONS, where she was an author of Social Trends. She too tweets actively as @lowercase JRF big A Aleks, that's with a K. Naomi Gibbons is Statistics Manager with GlaxoSmithKline, one of the world's largest research-based pharmaceutical and healthcare organisations, formed in 2000 from the merger of Glaxo Wellcome and SmithKline Beecham. She's active in statisticians in the pharmaceutical industry, SPI, the leading light of before, I'm sorry the programme said, behind the headlines. This is an initiative by the Science Media Centre supported by the Wellcome Foundation. Let me quote briefly. Given a set of data from a scientific study, assessing what conclusions can legitimately be drawn is a challenging task. For a busy journalist, performing such an analysis is often out of the question. One of the services the Science Media Centre can help to provide for journalists is independent statistical analyses of scientific papers with accompanying critiques of the author's own conclusions at a glance. Before the headlines analyses are offered to journalists in a simple format with clear summaries of what a scientific or pharmaceutical research paper claims. Whether the journalists then pay attention to the excellent analysis offered is something, again, to be discussed. But let's begin with Penny Young.
Right, okay. Thanks very much for inviting me. I guess I'll be drawing in particular on my different experiences. So when I was at Which, we had lots of really great content, and we were, to some extent, in control of our destiny. People wanted to hear us. We had good relationships with journalists. It was our content. Then working at the BBC, we had some great research content. Often, I'll be candid, often our job was actually to try and put quite a good sort of angle on that story, and I'll be using a particular example there. And then at NatCen Social Research, with the honourable exception of British Social Attitudes, we've got Alison Park here, where we do control the content, and it's our big moment in the year. Actually, what's interesting is we generate a huge amount of content, but we don't own the intellectual property usually, and often our clients, public sector clients, often government departments, are quite rightly keen to own the comms plan. And so a big challenge for us has been about how we can work with that and how we can get the research content out to journalists and talked about at the appropriate time. So I'll be drawing on my experience of how I think we're doing that increasingly well. We've still got a long way to go, but I think we have made a difference over recent years. So I really probably just wanted to start by saying, well, the second thing I wanted to say, and I'm probably maybe not going to do exactly what David wants me to do. I mean, I think it is true that we can all point to examples where journalists have just either misused the data, or they just don't seem incredibly numerate, or they use it in a very odd way. And my favourite recent example is from my old employer, I'm ashamed to say. This was on the BBC Online. England riots 1 year on, culprits jailed for 1,800 years. It's just a completely daft figure. Actually, in the body of the text, it was much more sensible. There were averages, there were comparisons with how that varied from the usual sentencing policy and so on, but completely pointless, meaningless headline. But in general, I think actually it'd be interesting to hear what people think in discussion. I think as a community, as a statistical community, as a research community, and I am going to be thinking mainly about sort of social research perspective, a social science perspective. I think we've actually got a lot to learn from journalists and the journalist community. If you think about the number of really good journalists and really good things that are going on at the moment, I'll just name a few. So the Guardian data blog, absolutely fantastic in terms of making data available really quickly, telling stories from it, helping us analyse stuff. That's kind of one radical thing. The Guardian, obviously, more generally, the work that Paul Lewis did with the LSE on the riots, all the different research methods that we use, including analysing social media as well as traditional research projects and some quite untraditional research methods, actually. I think just the speed with which that was generated, another really good example. Particular hero of mine, increasing hero, Mark Easton from the BBC, the Home editor. He is amazing the way he takes data once it's published, has something to say about it, and increasingly actually engages with the issues behind it from a technical perspective, and I'll use a particular example in a moment. Things like full fact, Channel 4's fact check, more or less. There's an awful lot of people that journalists can't just kind of say what they think any more actually than government departments, without there being an army of people who are actually looking at what's being said using data. So I think actually journalists in lots of ways are doing a great job. Evan Davis, another person who on the Today programme will often be engaging on, can you actually trust the data, can you trust the story? He will engage himself in methodological issues. If I've got one criticism, and it's not kind of those individuals can't do anything about it, as soon as you start to list the people, it is quite that was totally a list of men, actually. So I think there was a general invitation to the journalistic community to try and get more women involved in the areas of data journalism and really using data. That's actually my introduction. I just briefly want to touch on three themes, because I think ultimately, therefore, the problem isn't with the journalists. The problem and the opportunity is with all of us. I think it's much more about what we do to enable journalists to do their job properly than it is to criticise journalists. So that's my pitch, really. So my first theme is define or be defined, and this is definitely a lesson that I've learned through putting research out into and hoping the media will take some notice of it, and being alarmed at times when it's gone wrong, and really thought about lessons when it's gone right. And these aren't radical lessons, but I think all of us will agree that research statistics varies enormously in the extent to which people actually achieve the elements of define and be defined. And what I mean is, unless we, as a statistical community, can actually succinctly and concisely tell anybody who asks you, including your 9-year-old niece or whoever, what you're working on and why it's important and what you found out and what the limitations are, then I don't think we can kind of criticise the journalists when they don't do the perfect job on our behalf. So the first thing is about telling a story with data. Absolutely critical here, and some of you may have heard me use this example before, but again, a lesson that I learned quite early was when I was a researcher at the BBC, working with Matthew Bannister, who was the controller of Radio 1 at the time, who was having a really horrendous time, because basically he was making very radical schedule changes, and he was losing 1 million listeners every quarter, and we'd have a press conference every quarter. And as you can imagine, it was ghastly, people just running rings around us. And we'd have a meeting with him a few weeks beforehand, and he'd say, Penny, I've no idea what the data is going to say, but here are the key messages that you're going to do at the press conference. And he was really clear. He was like, I want you to show that it's getting younger, and I want you to show that my distinctive programs are doing well. So, because my first reaction was like, Matthew, I can't do that. You're losing young people really quickly as well, you know. But actually, of course, with indexing and looking at share and so on, and fancy ways of, well, not actually fancy, quite simple arithmetic ways of doing it, we were able to at least kind of present that Matthew's strategy is completely bang on target. But it did really teach me the lesson of, and obviously in general, I'm really keep the integrity of data massively important to me. But that was one of the examples where you're trying to just basically protect somebody and help them. But it really taught me the lesson of that's how you're clear, that's how you tell a story. You've got to be really clear about your key messages and your supporting evidence slot in after that. Don't just drone on about the data. There's a whole thing about reducing complexity. That's something that we work hard at. Again, unless you reduce the complexity, unless you leave a whole lot of stuff out, you won't get your story across concisely and succinctly. So that's another component of defining or be defined. And then thirdly, I think, of course, we have to be clear about the limits of the methodology and the uncertainty. But I do think as a community of statisticians and researchers, we actually really like explaining everything away and telling people 10 reasons why they can't take any notice of the data. And that's, I think, where it's a real challenge, because we do need to ask ourselves, well, why are we telling anybody about this if it's not statistically significant? And apologies to Jill, who I see is in the room, and this isn't really an example of this, because obviously you absolutely have to publish this, but I think I use it as a point where journalists are getting much more statistically literate about engaging with these issues. So just last week, Mark Easton, for example, the ONS statement that a fall of 36,000 in net migration is not statistically significant just shows how inaccurate the IPS, the International Passenger Survey statistics are. We may quibble with the use of inaccurate rather than imprecise, and we may say, well, kind of what can you do? But it is a kind of interesting example about how users are now not really prepared just to accept our disclaimers in a sense. So that was all about my first section. It was about define or be defined. If you don't tell the story, then journalists will not make something up, but they'll put their own story on it. My second theme, briefly, is about getting out and about, but not necessarily getting out and about, although we all have to do that, but getting out and about from your desk, from the comfort of your desk. And the theme here is the obvious one, about how social media has been an incredibly democratizing game changer, in my view. It's not very practical thought, actually. But if you think a few years back, how many of us would have been able to just contact a journalist really directly and have a conversation with them? And that has utterly changed. I mean, you've been just going through such a chain of press releases at your end, and is anybody going to take any notice? And you don't really know who the journalists are anymore. And just to give you an example of that from our own world, we had a great example recently where one of our crime and justice experts, who's great at engaging with people. So he's looking at who's talking about what, he's tweeting back, he's referring to our research, he's got an evidence-based point of view, and he struck up a relationship with a BBC journalist and ended up on the World at One, with some incredibly high-profile policemen and somebody from the riots panel and so on. So it is a way that you can just cut through things really, really quickly in a way that I think is quite startling, and as I say, is a real game changer. There are some myths, I think, around social media, and my favourite, or my least favourite myth in a sense, is somehow that it's the youngest people who are really keen on social media and Twitter at work, and somehow it's the people at the top of organisations that don't get it and are stopping them. That may be true to some extent, but my observation really is that actually as a community, again, of researchers and statisticians, we tend to all be a bit timid about using these things, because the way we tend to work is it's thoughtful, it's on time frames, you really want to check everything, and it's anathema to us to go, oh my God, if I don't say it in the next 10 minutes, the moment's going to have passed, and that's my opportunity, and can I say it in 140 characters, and will I get into trouble? And I think it is about, of course your organisations will have policies, but actually it's just changing hugely. If you think about people like Bob Kersley at the top of the civil service, who is now tweeting, I think we all have a lot more permission to do these things than sometimes we think we do, and it's definitely something I'm finding in our own organisation, that people across the organisation, where they're taking those opportunities and just really getting involved, is helping build their own experience and their own networks and their own profile. And in passing, I would say make sure that you make friends with your comms people as well. I mean, we're very different as a breed of animals, as statisticians and researchers, than comms people. They like to do things quickly, they like sweeping statements, but they've got the relationships, they're really good at spotting a story, and it's precisely because they're different that they're so useful to us. So definitely make friends with your comms people. My third theme really is a thought. I'm not sure how well evidenced it is, and I'm looking at David Walker because he's on an ESRC committee, he chairs an ESRC committee, but I think there's something about how we could have more radical thinking from some of our infrastructure bodies, in a sense. In general, I do think it's for us. It's for us as a community to make sure that journalists don't, if we do our jobs properly, they will be less likely to do their jobs not properly. But I do think there's a kind of interesting observation that if you think about in the social science community, the infrastructure institutions that are most concerned with knowledge and impact, their modus operandi tends to be to support the producers rather than users. So the money will tend to go to academics rather than journalists, for example. And I just think there are probably some ways in thinking about how the ESRC, for example, could be thinking about the journalist end rather more. So, for example, I'll just give you a very tiny example of one of the really big studies, really important to the UK, where the kind of concern is it's not getting used enough. We should use it more. And the natural and not bad kind of response is, right, well, let's fund an impact fellow for that study. I think the sort of thoughts about, well, why not fund a research assistant for a journalist that could make all the difference, that could use that study and other studies. So I think that's kind of one example. I think the data service, obviously the new data service, is a fantastic opportunity in thinking about reaching out to not just thinking about academics, but really making a reality of the wider group of stakeholders, including journalists. So those really are my three themes: define or be defined, get out and about more, even at your desk, and perhaps some more radical thinking needed by some of our infrastructure institutions. Overall, I think this is like a fantastically positive time actually for us all getting our work out to journalists and getting them to use it properly, and that's what we want to happen. We're all here because we want research to really be telling the story of what's going on and making a difference, and journalists are a fantastically important route to do that. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Ben.
Right, hi, I'm Aleks Collingwood. Thank you also for inviting me to talk today. I'm going to focus on my current job, Joseph Rowntree Foundation, because I work quite closely with the media in making sure they interpret our statistics as accurately as possible. So my aim is to talk to you about the best way that we do that and how we do that. So that's also a little bit different to what David wanted, but I think it will be helpful. So many of you will be familiar with Joseph Rowntree Foundation already. I'm just going to give you an introduction first, very briefly to what we do, and then how we're structured, because this will help you see and understand how we work with the media. So our underlying aim is to reduce poverty. The ultimate aim is to end it completely in the UK if we're able to do that. The aims are to get a long-lasting change in poverty with people and places all over the UK, to encourage communities to thrive, and just to make a society more equal in general. We're a charitable foundation, so unlike any other social research organisations I worked for, we actually have money to spend on doing the research. But a main part of our work in particular, mine is not just doing the research, but making sure that we go further with it when we've got it, and making sure the right people have it. And basically we try not to stop until we've made some kind of progress and changed a policy, or at least we've done something. So as I said, part of my job is to make sure we're reported correctly. So afterwards we meet politicians, we meet relevant organisations. So I'm looking to myself. I've written very strange notes on the train all over the place. We are very rarely interpreted wrongly, as we do so much groundwork at the beginning to make sure that we're interpreted correctly. If if a statistic is misinterpreted, then we'll ring the journalist or the organisation and tell them in a friendly way that it's been misinterpreted and get it changed. If it's wrong, then we'll ring them. Our media office rings in a much more stern way. I work in the policy and research department, and we are structured in the way that we have Julia Unwin, our chief executive, then we have a research and policy director, an assistant research and policy director, and then 10 programme managers, of which I'm one of them. And alongside our programme department, we have a big communications team, a big media team, and a big events team. So they're all working with the programme managers on different programmes. And we also have a support administration team as well. How we work is we're split into 3 themes. Well, actually, I'm the only one who isn't, but all the other programme managers are split into three teams, into poverty, ageing society, and place and housing statistics. And the programme managers are also, it's quite equal really between quantitative and qualitative research. And we commission out projects, usually with open tenders, to government organisations, academics, places such as NatCen, and these programmes can be of different lengths of time. They're all very directly related to the themes that we're in. We have a comms plan right from the beginning, and we work really closely with the comms team and the media team right from the very beginning of the programme, so they're involved with us all the way. So they're already making our basis for when the release and the launch comes out to get out as accurate coverage as possible. So right from the beginning, we're not relying on journalists getting anything cold. They've been well aware of what is going to come out. And even with draft releases, they'll have some statistics under like embargo. We have launch events, and people go meet key politicians and things first. My role is a statistics and quantitative person for JRF, so luckily for me, I'm not assigned to any of the 3 themes. I'll get involved with each of them depending on which ones need a statistical person in there. So I'm independent. I'm the programme manager of monitoring poverty and social exclusion, so I have a little bit of each theme in there. I also have a big project with IFS at the moment about ageing society and pensions. I represent JRF on various different statistical committees. I've been on select committees a few times at House of Commons for keeping the census and things like that. Advisory groups, I'm on the advisory group with ONS for various census analysis programmes. I do quite a lot of blogging, which I'll talk about later, which is all to do with the same thing. And the other main thing I do is I'm involved with JRF's data strategy, which is also going to be aimed at people getting the right facts and figures, and I'll talk about that a bit as well. And as I said, I have a close relationship with media and communications, and I get a lot of emails directly from journalists asking me for key statistics or asking me to read what they've said and agree whether I think it's true or not. Correct. Maybe not true. So how we protect ourselves against misreporting? Well, these are the main ways we do it. We work with journalists both before the launch and during the launch. They contact us directly, and we also proactively contact the key ones that we want to be involved. As I said, we proactively seek out the media interviews. We have general media training once a year anyway, all the programme managers do, and then we also have specific media training for your actual programme before it just comes out, with a media officer from JRF that's assigned to your programme, and they're there at every single interview, and they'll talk to the journalist first, talk to you first. So we have like an in-between person. And we have our launch events, not for every programme, but for most programmes, where we have key speakers, we have a wider audience, including lots of media, and we meet with the journalists both before and afterwards. And we have user-friendly releases, and we use social media. So we have press releases, we have findings, which are short summaries, and that are quick and succinct with the main points that we want to get across, so not all of them. We have blogs at the ready to come out on the day that something's published, and we contact journalists to know these blogs are coming out on these days, so hopefully they will just take the blog. We tweet. We have a social media person who works full-time doing JRF social media and designs all the tweets for us really for each time a release comes out. And they have the same link, the link to the report, but they also have like key headline statistics to try and attract different people to see the tweets that send them to the same report. And then we're also developing our sort of knowledge of infographics. Well, I say I am trying to get my head around it, designing infographics. And we also have a contract with Durant, a media marketing organisation, so that they have keywords. They have JRF keywords like poverty, minimum income standard, things like that, and they completely scour daily all traditional broadcasts, so television, radio, TV, obscure local papers, technical magazines, technical professional magazines, online and in print, and send us anything daily so we get a really good coverage of what we have out there. I just want to give you 2 examples. This is one of the ones I was managing this year. It came out in Northern Ireland. This is kind of like a summary of everything we did for the media. So the people got the findings first, the press release first. We had our blogs ready, and the blogs went on the JRF website and most of the key national newspapers. Pithy tweets at the ready. That's the word we're supposed to use. Same links as I said. And we had all our interviews lined up first, and we mix and match. So we had the New Policy Institute, who are the actual authors for this programme, myself and Julia Unwin. There's a few key ones as well. The day before the launch, we had a pre-launch briefing with about 20 journalists, and Julia Unwin was there as well, and the authors. And basically, we try and turn the numbers into like a human context thing to make sure that they understand it properly, nail any misconceptions, and just make sure that they understand the key facts properly before the launch date. We then had the launch event in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland is a fantastic place to do launch events, if any of you do, because they're just so pleased for you to be there and interested. It's fantastic. We had about 150 people. We had MPs doing key talks and discussion sessions, and it was a really great event. We had a live Twitter feed, and I was told by the social media guy I'll have to say hashtag, so that you can search for like Mopsy Northern Ireland, and you'll see everything that's going on that day. And apparently the ratio is it changes from 200 people seeing the tweet to 20,000 people seeing the tweet if it's when it's retweeted and everything. And this also encourages accurate reporting, accurate media reporting, because people are quoting people as they've actually just said it, so not when they remember it half an hour later or an hour later. And we had the Durant media coverage for the whole event, which I have copies if anybody wants to see, but I just have a few. And the second example is the minimum income standard that came out in July. This isn't one of my programs, one of my colleagues, Chris Golden. So the challenge here was for the media team to translate a heavy data report into an easy to understand and report narrative, mainly to attract the journalists and just to make sure the journalists interpreted it correctly. We also did a huge push on the key headline figures, which just interest. I've got the key headline figures on the side. For a single person, it's £193 to have a minimum income standard. And a couple with 2 children, $36,800 for the year to have an acceptable standard of living. Those were the key facts that we gave to the journalists. Also had a pre-launch briefing, Julia Unwin and the authors. And we have bespoke briefings to the media that have shown a keen interest. So it was Mark Easton, who Penny mentioned already, BBC home editor. They got a bespoke pre-briefing, sort of on the condition that they gave us a lead exclusive, and we had the 10 o'clock news slot as well. This was ensuring large viewing figures of accurate reporting, and other media figure would pick it up. So we need to tell the story in the best way possible, and sometimes that is infographically. So this is one of our infographics that we had that was published in quite a few newspapers, and we had it on boards at our launch event to just put it out as much as we can. It's used in schools in Northern Ireland as well, so people just take the picture rather than interpret the statistics themselves. And then we have another one that's showing that half of the children in poverty are living in working households in Northern Ireland. This one's from the minimum income standard that's just come out. this is an interactive infographic on the website, so you can go sideways, either side, and it comes up with a little more. JRF, we have a podcast channel. Don't know if I say channel. We have a podcast site where you can link it to RSS feed. You can also subscribe to it with iTunes. And we just have just short interviews that we've pre-recorded, or all the interviews that have come out on telly or radio. They're all on there, so you can listen to them at any time. We have a YouTube channel which shows the same things, and then plus we have different YouTube tips from people who've been involved in different programs, giving their experiences and things like that. Okay, so I just wanted to slide on social media as well. So tweeting, as I said, really important for us. We were actually, in my job interview, I was told that I needed to tweet at least 5 times a day. I hadn't been set up to tweet then, that was a year ago, but now we're all on it all the time. We use it a lot. As I said, we have a social media person. We're followed by key journalists. Well, we have a JRF tweet account, and then all the program managers have their own tweet account as well, so we follow different separate things. JRF has about up to 5,000 retweets a day, just from the JRF account. We do lots of blogging, like I mentioned before. We have the blogs ready for report releases. And then we also have blogs, like I write blogs interpreting statistics that have been released by other organisations, just to make sure that it's interpreted correctly, specifically things that I think could be interpreted wrongly. So one example is when all the welfare reform the idea of the welfare reform cuts all came out, and it said the larger families were going to be affected. I wrote quite a few blogs about who the larger families were and where they are, and so who was actually going to be affected. This was put in Telegraph, Guardian, blog was, and our JRF site. When the census figures just came out, or blogged on what these ageing society statistics actually mean for us. That went to the Bevan Foundation, to the Guardian, to the Telegraph, JRF, and we also have a JRF Facebook page. We're just building on that now. I don't think that's used too much at the moment. And finally, I'm just going to talk to you briefly about our data strategy that I do. So the aim of our data strategy, which is about a third of my work, is to make JRF a place to come to for facts on poverty, unemployment, ageing society, housing, homelessness, that kind of thing. And if we don't have the figures ourselves, to tell you where to get them from. So we've got about 100 indicators spread over the 3 themes, and each statistical indicator will have its own page, and on the page we'll have like an interactive graph, have it broken down by ethnicity, gender, and then have a brief interpretation of what we think these statistics mean. So our take on it and how to understand the interpretation of what they mean. And the audience is really wide-ranging, and one of the key people in the audience is obviously the media, so they can look up anything they want and broadcast it to the nation. So it's everyone and anyone really, government, NGOs, students, general public. But there has actually been a poverty site which has just stopped being outdated, so we're hoping to slowly take over from this. Like Shelter have a huge data bank as well, homelessness statistics, but we will point to Shelter rather than try and take it all on ourselves, since they're doing such a good job already. So our key recommendations to avoid misreporting are engaging with the journalists from the beginning, nailing misconceptions, identifying human angles, putting ourselves forward to tell the story, like proactively going out and seeking the attention so that make sure we can tell it accurately, and getting the authors to do the same. Provide clear, user-friendly press releases, findings, and more so it's going to be infographics with us. And the social media aspect as well, as Penny talked about, more with our blogs and more tweeting. Okay, that's all.
Okay, so we'll take a slightly different tack now, talk a bit about science reporting in the media. And really I'm just going to tell you a bit about the Before the Headlines project, which is something I've been involved in for about the last year, involved in the setup and the running of it. So if I start to tell you a bit about the Science Media Centre, for those of you that don't know. So the Science Media Centre was set up about 10 years ago now. I think they're just coming up to their 10th anniversary. And they were set up following these kind of headlines appearing in the media. We've got GM foods, autism, MMR link, there was BSE stories. And they were set up because of the way these were reported in the media. And the Science Media Centre is an independent venture working to promote the voices, stories and views of the scientific community to the national news media when science is in the headlines. It's not for profit and it's funded by media groups, charities, university, pharmaceutical industry, professional associations. So it's funded by a lot of different bodies. And really what they say is, they're trying to work with journalists to help them get it right in the first place rather than trying to beat them up about it afterwards. So what is before the headlines? Well, I think right from the very beginning, the Science Media Centre has provided these, they call them roundups to the major UK media outlets. And what they do, they receive embargoed papers from all the major science journals at the Science Media Centre. They go through them. They decide which stories are likely to be picked up by the media. I think it's usually quite obvious which ones are going to end up the headline grabbers. They've got a database of experts they go out to those experts, they ask them for their opinion, and they do ask for opinion in these. And then they use those quotes, get sent out to journalists and say it might be newsrooms, print journalism, and major news organisations. And then those quotes may be used by the journalists. Often when you see the articles written up, then they say, quote from Professor blah, so that's come from the Science Media Centre, sending them out the roundups, putting them in touch with the people who know. So now what we've added to that, for health and medical related research at the moment at least, we provide an objective statistical critique of the paper, and that's included with the roundup. So at the start you have the opinion and the quotes, and then you have this clear, concise, objective stats critique of the paper, outlining their strengths and weaknesses. And the idea is that it's really in a very simple, clear and concise format to help the journalists. So when they've got the press release, which may be slightly over-exaggerating the results, that helps them to cut through that without having to try and go through the paper, which they won't have time to do, which I'll come to a bit later. So I'll just, not to go through in detail, but just to show you, this is a couple of parts from one of our reviews. I've cut out a couple of bits of it, but it's come to show you what, they're in a standard template, they're in a very clear, concise format. So you've got the data, the title at the top. We tried to have one sentence, which almost tries to anticipate what you think the headline would be and tell them whether they can sell it. So here we say the paper provides weak evidence of relationship between long-term increased alcohol consumption and decreased risk of rheumatoid arthritis in women. We have a summary section, and then we go through some of the conclusions. So we say what the main conclusion is. We say that the paper doesn't adequately differentiate between moderate and high alcohol consumption. The groups are lumped together. Some other bits maybe say that no statistical association was found between increased consumption of any wine, beer or liquor. Results do trend in that direction. In other words, middle there, why was 3 drinks a week used as a cut-off? Have they looked at all the data and found that was a nice thing to use? We also talk about strengths. One strength is attempt to bring down alcohol consumption in different ways. Talk about what the authors acknowledge. And I have to say that's something that sometimes happens that, I'm sure you know, if you read a paper, the authors can often be very good at pulling out the limitations of their study, but then the press release and the subsequent article in the newspaper, those limitations have gone along the way. So it's to kind of bring that out back to the journalists. So a little bit about what I've learned in the last year, what my preconceptions are and what I've learned now. So actually, science and other specialist journalists really do want to get it right, which I guess I was maybe slightly surprised about. And actually, like Tom at the Science Media Centre, my colleague there, will say that he finds they're much more similar, the specialist journalists and the science journalists are much more similar across the different papers, so the tabloids versus the broadsheets, than they are maybe with the other journalists within their own paper. So they're actually very similar. He said they do want to get it right, and they have to fight themselves for accuracy in their own newsrooms, and the tabloids can have the hardest fight of that. They don't have time to research his stories thoroughly. There is a So there's a Daily Mail journalist who said that she gets 100 press releases a day. She has to then pitch about 15 as stories. She has to write 5 and then they publish 2. And that's the same every day. So if you're getting 100 press releases a day, but you have to get down to 2 to write, you haven't got time to research everything thoroughly. You have to rely on the press release. You have to rely that that's been achieved correctly, because you can't go through every single paper yourself. And then again, as I said, the press releases can be as much to blame. Some of them are very good, and I'm not going to say they're not, but some of them we have to be careful, and sometimes the limitations are much further down, or just the construction of them is maybe slightly biased. So again, that's partly what we try and do, is bring out those things that maybe have not made it into the press release.
So who's producing the press release?
Sometimes it's from the journal. So often it's the paper. So the paper comes out with the press release from the office of the journal. And the headlines. So science, and I didn't know this at all until this. So science correspondents don't write their own headlines. It's the editors that will write the headlines, and they don't have any control over it. And also, actually, we're probably never going to change that. We're never going to change what the headlines are, because the purpose of headlines is to draw someone to a story. We don't want them to be completely accurate, but actually, if it draws them to the story and then the article is written well, maybe we don't need to be so concerned that the headline that drew them in was a little bit over the top. And especially in tabloids, they're going to use their humour. They're going to use things to draw you to the story and funny pictures. Again, if the story's right, maybe we should be happy with that. And really, we need to work with journalists rather than battle against them. The internet age, there's blogs and things that are a great source of information, but there's a government survey in 2011, and 54% of people say they use television, and 32% of people say they use print newspapers as their main source of science news. So only 2% of people use blogs. So all this other stuff is really useful, but you can't forget that actually there's a lot of people out there, that's where their main source of science, and we need to work and do what we can to ensure that the science is reported accurately there. A bit about the feedback we've had over the last year. So we have filled really positive feedback, and actually this came about partly through discussions with journalists. They were coming to the Science Media Centre and saying they wanted help. They want this. So there's just a few quotes there saying how useful they think it is, it's invaluable to them. And it's really nice here, it says, it's good to see it broken down so clearly that it assumes a degree of knowledge which seems pitched at the right level. So it's great to have feedback to know we're doing the right thing, it's helping. As for impact, it can kind of be hard, because obviously we receive the paper a couple of days before it's going to go into print. Just turn it around quickly, send them our review, and then you can see the story in the paper the next day or not, but you have no idea what it would have looked like if you hadn't written your review. A couple of times I think I've noticed you can have a look yourself, and you can see that some limitations that were lower in the press release might have made it higher up in the article. You think we might have had something to do with that. There were a couple of very solid pieces of feedback that was great though. So we did have, there was a broadsheet newspaper, or 2 here. So one of them decided not to run a story because, and this one I think it was in pancreatic cancer, and actually it was quite a good hypothesis generating study. But it was exactly that, it was hypothesis generating, and a news story for the general public, it wasn't a news story. If you worked in pancreatic cancer, okay, it was very useful. So they decided not to run the story, and the second one decided to run a small article. And a lot of these that we find, it's those classic situations where the study showed an association, but no causal relationship. And so us pointing that out very clearly meant they still ran the story, but they made it a much smaller article in the newspaper than they'd originally planned earlier on in the day. And actually, an unexpected outcome of one review is the press office actually rewrote their press release, which we don't expect to happen very often, and we often wouldn't have the time to go back, but we did respond that I think there was actually an error in it as well, so we went back to them and it was rewritten. And also the Science Media Centre does have sister organisations, and they'll share all this information, so it does even go out to places like Canada and Australia, so if they're running the same stories, then it can go worldwide. So my last one is a bit of a plug, really, to say. If you want to help, this is all run by volunteer statisticians. Lots of them at the moment are from the pharmaceutical industry. We'd like to balance that out a bit. There's a huge level of support and guidance from the Science Media Centre. There is no payment, it is voluntary. It's great for your communication skills because you're working with having to take something, a scientific paper, and work out how you need to report that to a journalist. And that's, you know, a great skill to have. And achievement you see when you see the story the next, feel when you see the story the next day is quite good. So there's my email address there if you want any more information. You can come to the PSI stand. And also to say it's really not a huge time commitment. We think a review takes 2 to 3 hours, and we just ask that people try and do it twice a year. So we're not asking for a lot, but if anyone's interested in helping us out, then get in touch.